Hi, and thanks for joining us this week for yet another episode of Differential Diagnosis, where we're differentially diagnosing every single episode of House M.D. My name's Harvey, and I'll be co-hosting the episode, with Gaz.
Hi, nice to be back.
There you go, we're just two friends who love House. Gaz started watching it this year. I watched it several years ago, and so with two different perspectives, we thought we'd come at it, revisit the show, and chat about it some more. And this week we'll be analysing the ninth episode of Season 1, DNR, Do Not Resuscitate.
Yeah, this is a really, really interesting episode. Also, it's the first one to be written by the medical consultant for the show, David Foster, MD, which I think is interesting to bring up. I think at this point he was part-time writer on this and like a consultant at the same time. But I'm sure it's something that David Shaw can clarify if it needs be. He can always get in touch with us, of course.
There you go.
But
that's why Gaz is here for the research, because I did not know that.
Yeah, I mean, it was just digging through some hyperlinks on the wiki. But hey,
since you found that House wiki, you are using it like the fine resource that it is.
House.fandom.com. We're not sponsored by them, by the way. We just use them as a resource.
But once again, we're open to it. Any kind of sponsorship.
You complete shill. I'll never do it. I'll never surrender. I bet by episode season 4 episode 20 we'll be doing CBD oil adverts.
What's the thing? I was actually thinking about this because I don't really care about this. We just enjoy doing the podcast. It's just really nice to be able to talk about this.
Yeah.
And just talk about House. But I don't really know where ads would go in this.
We'd find a way.
Because it's not structured. So we just the whole thing is that we watch an episode while it's going on, we talk about it, and then we make notes about what we want to talk about, but we try and keep it as organic as possible. And I don't know, we just have to cut it really awkwardly in the middle of a conversation for click this link for 10% off your latest CBD oil, and then it would go back to us just talking normally.
No, you'd also have to do a testimonial and say, look, I've been trying the CBD oil for 10 years and well, it's transformed my life, and you can get it here, blah, blah, blah. And you'd have to do it with bumper music. So halfway through you'd have to do a non sequitur cut with some bumper music, and then talk about how razors have changed your life, or oh, I'm not a connoisseur of wine, but these guys are. You should try their wine. And now I drink it all the time. Oh, I'm drunk now. The wine is really effective. It'd be just that. So it's something we need to think about. We need to be thinking about shilling ourselves.
That's true.
Selling our souls.
Well, as I say, I'm not sure it would work, but I'm not open to the idea. So get in touch.
Yeah, please get in touch.
Before that, let's instead of shilling some products, let's shill our amazing analysis of House M.D. Season 1, Episode 9, DNR.
So the synopsis of this, which is from house.fandom.com, DNR is a first season episode of House, which first aired on February the 1st, 2005.
God, that's a long time ago.
Yeah.
Sorry, go on.
I know. I think, 15. No, about 16. I was just about to turn 16. I was 15 at the time.
So you could legally watch this because it's 15 rated.
Oh, wow. I don't know. Did those ratings transfer over? Anyway,
yeah.
I'm going to restart the synopsis because I completely sidetracked myself. DNR is a first season episode of House, which first aired on February 1st, 2005. I was 15 at the time. A famous musician, played by Harry J. Lennox, with ALS, loses all hope when he realizes he can no longer play his trumpet. However, House doubts the ALS diagnosis is correct and encourages Foreman to pursue an aggressive course of treatment. When House defies the patient's Do Not Resuscitate order and is kept away from the patient, he still won't let the matter go. Yeah.
I'm very thankful for the ice bucket challenge because I now know what ALS is.
Yeah, it's not a good one. It's famously named after the Yankee baseball player Lou Gehrig, which is referred to in the show, as he was perhaps the most prominent sufferer of this horrible, progressive, debilitating disease.
Wow.
Yeah.
I didn't know that either. That's really interesting.
Oh, glad to bring it up.
Well, we've got a lot to unpack, so let's get on with it. Yeah, so this is it's a musical episode of House. House is a musician, so I think this is probably the first time that because I believe the patient in the fictional world is quite a famous trumpet player who is a band is trying to get him on their to like play on their album, and they're not sure whether or not he's going to turn up for the recording or not, which he does because he's sort of basically retired because of this ALS diagnosis that he's received from another doctor. And yes, but this is quite an interesting episode, at least in the fact that House is actually enthusiastic to meet the patient because he respects him. So it's nice that they chose a musician because we've worked out based on just House that he's a great musician, which is pretty much comes from the fact that Hugh Laurie, who plays him, is also a very talented musician. So it would make sense to it would be a waste to not use Hugh Laurie's like musical talents in the show.
Yeah, and I also think that it also plays to the one of the basic components of House is Sherlock Holmes, and Sherlock Holmes was a prolific violinist, and you see that in the Arthur Conan Doyle books. So I think also there's an interesting part to this, which is House is sympathetic to artists. He likes artists particularly, so they don't compromise with their art. And I think that's a parallel with how House treats medicine, or at least his gift. It's something that gets brought up in dialogue between Giles and House.
Yeah, the patient and him have a conversation about their obsession to their art, his being music and House's being medicine. But yeah, it's a nice touch. Like I know that we in the last episode, if you listen to it, we were I was a bit more negative about the setup and how much more basic it was in terms of like just the patients. I thought they were a bit flat. I didn't think there was any real drama, but you can immediately tell from the moment this is set up that he's a musician. He's sort of losing his craft, but the music's all that he lives for. And there's immediately an obvious parallel with House.
Yeah.
And you can tell from the first 2 minutes of the show that, right, there's something here. There's something to work with.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's refreshing to see that again. It makes the last episode feel more like a bit of a blip than anything because they can clearly do it. Like, I think there's been like 4 or 5 episodes already out of the 9, which have been pretty great in terms of their utilizing the House formula to their best.
Also, I like the fact that Harry Lennox is in this. He's a really good actor. It's like a kind of bit of a celebrity cameo because I think by this time he'd been prominent in the Matrix sequels.
Who did he play in the Matrix?
He played the general in Zion.
Oh yeah,
Or the
I
giant
was trying to think where I
mechanoid
remembered him from.
robots.
Yeah,
But
that's him.
he's also a really good actor, and it's a nice little cameo that he brings a lot of depth to the character. He's kind of, in an acting sense, on par with what Hugh Laurie's trying to portray as well. They're kind of, the characters are mirrors of each other, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, and it's I mean, obviously the casting department for House is great,
Yeah.
and they should always cast the best actors, but he like this episode turns up a lot in people's, like, if you look at a list of people's favorite House episodes, DNR turns up a lot,
Yeah.
which is very impressive that people's favorite episode is like the 9th one they ever made out of like 173.
Yeah.
And it but I think a lot of that is for is his name Harry Lennox?
Harry Lennox, yeah.
Yeah, like his performance is fantastic.
Yeah.
And yeah, he really like helps carry that episode. He seems to like really portray a kind of Houseian obsessive artist very well.
Yeah.
And it's good as well because when there's a bad actor in House, it really stands out because the cast are incredible.
Yeah. Like
Yeah.
the regular casting will just show it all up really well. I think
Yeah,
the other,
like
and just casting aside, I think the other thing about it is that it's showing a character with a similar temperament to House, but as in life, people with similar temperaments can analyze other people with similar temperaments really well. They can see clearly into another character or another person, even if they're blind to their own issues. But in this case, yeah, he acts like a bit like a mirror rather than it's not like there's no friction between the two of them apart from the DNR order. There's like a synergy between the two characters, between House and Giles.
yeah, and House at no point. So I don't. If people don't know what a DNR is, you learn it in the episode. But if you just have forgotten, it's yeah, it's just you can sign a Do Not Resuscitate order, which means that when you basically go into shock or stop breathing, that they can't legally bring you back. And House does ignore that DNR because it's some crazy stuff that House does. He doesn't respect the rules.
Yeah.
But an important thing about that is that under any other circumstances, when a patient signs a DNR, House would be like, "Oh, you're an idiot. You're an idiot." He often, like a couple of times that people have refused treatment, he just goes in and says, "You're being ridiculous." In the first episode with the teacher, he just says she's being irrational. In the 6th episode, Damned If You Do, with the nun, he just says, "You're just being stupid and like thinking that you're going to go to heaven, but that's a stupid reason to die." In this one, though, he doesn't call him stupid. He like respects him. He says, yeah, he only wants to die because he's received a like a ALS diagnosis, which is a death sentence. But he never says that he's making. He never says he's being stupid. He just says it's a bad decision. Yeah, he's only making that decision based on the ALS diagnosis. But he's not saying that he's being stupid. He actually says he's being completely rational given the circumstances. It's just that the circumstances aren't correct.
Yeah.
And it's nice to see House approach like a patient more on that level. Like we've had a lot of just House just going, "Oh, you're an idiot. I'm a genius. That's it." But it's nice to see a bit more complexity from House, that like he respects people's work. He like can talk to people more on the same level. But I guess like a problem with the writers is that because they've established House as that he like feels he's so above everyone that he kind of treats everyone like that because everyone is below him. So it's nice that they've written a character who is on the same level of House, so we can kind of have a glimpse into him being more like normal.
And also, I'd like to think you can see House is playing Charles's records, so he's trying to get a sense of the respect that he has for him. He admires his art. He listens to the art. He analyzes the art. But the really interesting thing is that I think, apart from the DNR note order, that's kind of a red herring for the conflict within this episode. There is no conflict between patient and House. The real conflict in this episode is between Foreman and House. That is front and center of this episode.
Yeah, and it's people who listened to the last episode that we did will know that there's always been a conflict between House and Foreman. And last episode, they tried to establish that Foreman is worried he's becoming like House. But Foreman is very driven. He wants to be a great doctor. He just doesn't want to be like House. And I noted that I thought that was quite lazily done by showing that Foreman and like House dress the same. And I was like hoping that they could have made it more like an ideological comparison to the two. And this episode actually does that.
Yeah, you got what you wanted.
I did, and it was possible. I mean, I know that it was probably a lot to ask for in that episode as well, but yeah, I mean, you could have skipped that episode and come straight to here and gotten a perfectly like well-written Foreman House comparison, which is done using Giles, the musician Giles's other doctor, who is a previous associate of Foreman's.
Yeah, Dr.
Gaz, do you
Hamilton.
want to unwrap the situation with that? Because it's not actually House who's been asked to help Giles. What's happened is Giles's like current doctor, who's like, you know, diagnosed him with ALS and all these things, has said has actually forwarded him on to Foreman, because he knows Foreman and Foreman used to work for him. So House isn't actually involved in this. House isn't the boss, which is quite an interesting power play, because it's really Foreman deciding whether to listen to Marty, who's the Giles's current doctor, or House, who has nothing to do with the case, but he respects House, even though he doesn't want to give that away.
Yeah, and and the other thing about it is the friction culminates with the conflict between Foreman, who wants to adhere to the DNR notice, and House, who does not, and House is utterly unrepentant about what he did, even though he knows it's legally assaulting the patient. He doesn't see it that way. He doesn't see it as assault. He sees it as saving the life of someone. But the interesting part of that scene where there's that crisis is that Foreman challenges him but doesn't stop him. He's unable to stop House, even though Foreman is de facto in charge of this case, which you see in like one of the establishing shots where they're going through all the symptoms of why Giles has had this attack, where Foreman is standing up and writing down all the bits and trying to figure it out and leading the discussion. House is there just bouncing his cane and balancing it on his face in absolute boredom.
Yeah, absolutely.
So much power. There's so much, that power dynamic is always fluctuating a little bit, and they're both chafing at it. But I think the fact that Foreman couldn't stop him, he just says, "You can't do this," and he just did it.
Yeah. Yeah, completely. I also liked that. So basically, House very quickly, Giles he stops breathing, and House breaks the DNR really quickly. And I quite like that the DNR isn't it isn't used as like a dramatic thing at the end. So like House breaks the DNR. House immediately breaks the DNR.
Yeah, it's just
which as you say, like it sets up a lot of the conflict of the episode, but it also very quickly, as you say, shows Foreman doesn't do anything. He just says, "You can't do this," because I think secretly Foreman, this kind of shows the internal conflict, is even though like Foreman agrees with the Dr. Marty that yes, this person has asked for a DNR and it's completely fine, and all patient you know wants should be respected. When House starts breaking it, Foreman doesn't stop him, because Foreman is also agreeing with that other philosophy of House, is that you're a doctor, you're there to treat them, and sustaining life and solving problems is what's most important.
Well, he also wants to keep in a Houseian way. House wants to keep the problem alive so that he can solve it.
Yeah.
And that's another thing that also gets brought up later on in the episode with a discussion between Wilson and House, but we'll get to that. And also there's internal, like you say, you've just alluded to, there's an internal conflict for Foreman. He's conflicted between the kind of typical way a doctor is supposed to conduct themselves in terms of ethics, which is what Dr. Hamilton, is it Hamilton?
Yeah, that's Marty,
Yeah,
Dr. Hamilton.
Marty,
Let's call him Hamilton from
Marty
now.
kind of embodies, and also his own struggle against wanting to solve the problem, wanting to keep the problem going so that it can be solved. So there's an internal conflict within Foreman to do that, the House and the Marty conflict. And then you've got the external emulation, or what you would say emulation conflict between House and Foreman that goes on. He's never really in an external conflict against Hamilton at all, or Marty, sorry, at all. But
Yeah, he like obviously we've noted in other episodes that House is dismissive of other doctors because he thinks they're very like occupational, whereas he's kind of like he does like it as a way of life. He's a doctor because it's a way of life and he loves it. He doesn't do it as a job necessarily. And yeah, he's like dismissive of Hamilton or Marty, but it's actually Foreman being caught in the middle where the real drama is. It's not just House being rude to Marty that makes it interesting. It's the way Foreman kind of balances them both. And it's quite interesting as well because Foreman is polite to Marty, but he's rude to House.
yeah,
But at no point does he just say to House, like, yeah, at no point does he, but you note that at no point he just says to House, look, why don't you go away? I hate you. I'm not working with you. Like, he's rude to House, but it's not because he hates House. It's just because that's the kind of thing that House allows. So it's actually interestingly, the way he talks to Marty is actually the dishonest way.
yeah,
Like, that's the weirder way. Like, in any other situation, if a character was being nice to someone and horrible to someone else, you would say, oh, the being horrible to someone else is the more, like, negative, like, kind of bad, like, social situation. But actually, the way that Foreman's nice to Marty, he's actually pretending. He doesn't really feel that way.
yeah.
Like, him and House arguing is actually more real and more true to what Foreman wants. Like, he doesn't want this nice doctor life that Marty's trying to set up for him. He actually wants that House way of life. And the episode is Foreman struggling with that and coming to terms with that.
Well, he doesn't know. He's also torn between the prestige element. So Foreman and I'm going to call him Hamilton. Hamilton.
Yeah, let's call him Hamilton.
Go into go for lunch. And they're recounting how they went to the cigar bar and had a cigar and drank some probably amazing drinks and just regaling their past stories with each other. And they're all these kind of materialistic, superficial, well, for House, superficial experiences.
It's not about the medicine.
It's never about the truth. It's always about,
Yeah.
do you remember when we did this? Do you remember when we did this paper, when we did this research? It's all very, it's external. It's external values, right? Instead of, like, it's all about acquisition of prestige and wealth and recognition, whereas House never wants those things. He wants internal. He has intrinsic values. That's it. What Marty Hamilton kind of exemplifies is the exterior or extrinsic values that one can pursue in that vocation. Going to the cigar bar, having a good cigar, having a good whiskey and all of that sort of stuff, and presenting papers and getting recognition and doing lectures and everything. And those extrinsic values are what he thinks is the vocation of a medic on top of saving lives. Whereas for House, he lives a very insular and very small world. He inhabits that, but he's the master of that world, and it's in pursuit of the intrinsic values, such as truth. They're things in and of themselves, rather than for a means to an end for him. Solving a patient's problem is not a means to a research paper for him. It's in itself a means to an end, which has its own pathologies because he's an obsessive, he's antisocial, he doesn't pursue things for frivolous means. And that's, in my opinion, the central conflict is between extrinsic values and intrinsic values. And the good and bad of those things are exemplified by those two characters that are trying to vie for Foreman's soul, as it were.
Yeah. And you alluded to it before with Wilson and the House exchange, but Wilson says to House, "Oh, you don't have the Messiah complex; you have the Rubik's complex."
Yeah.
And doctors are traditionally said to have a Messiah complex,
Yeah.
because it's about the prestige of helping people,
Saving other
it's like
people.
this very human connection thing. Whereas the Rubik's complex just says, "Oh, it's a problem to be solved," and that's kind of sums up the difference. I mean, there's all these elements of the kind of like materialistic elements and the social elements of being a doctor, that it's a prestigious thing, which Foreman grapples with, but it's that extra, like it's the Messiah complex, Rubik's complex, like dichotomy. Like, do you want this to be about healing, or do you want this to be about like solving a problem and making a difference?
And there are good and bad elements to that in both ways, and they get explored
Yeah.
throughout the entire course of the season. We see the
Yeah,
pathologies of House
absolutely.
come
And
out.
Foreman wants both.
He wants
I think that's
he wants everything,
yeah.
but
He wants to be like the sweetness of Hamilton, but the like calculating of House. And what he actually learns by, even you kind of see the way he tries to walk the social tightrope of talking to them, and he utterly fails,
Mm.
because what you discover at the end of this episode, I mean, possibly there could be a middle ground, but Foreman certainly doesn't find it. Foreman realizes he has to choose.
yeah, he's in the
And,
worst. He's been asked to choose between pursuing it in this kind of professional way, because Foreman wants to be in a position of authority. He really desires that, and for good reasons, because he thinks he's a good doctor and he deserves to be. He thinks he deserves to be able to do that. He thinks he has the means and the capacity to do it, and he wants to pursue it. And he's been given two alternative paths, but they're two very extreme paths, right? There's one guy who just does the kind of rubber chicken circuit. Oh, I'm doing these lectures this year or whatever. And House is like, I don't do lectures or anything. I don't even barely visit the patients. I treat them as problems and try and save their lives. Leave me alone.
absolutely.
So he's in a bit of he's in a very difficult situation.
Yeah. Well, so another interesting element. Now, these are our favorite episodes. We notice this with the Socratic method, that it's when the medicine and the human drama like equal to each other. They kind of communicate. They're thematically tied.
Yeah.
And that turns up with the actual treatment. So within the episode, as you would know, Gaz, it's that the doctor is treating him. So Hamilton has already diagnosed it as ALS. House doesn't believe it's ALS, and so over time, throughout the episode, it turns out the patient is starting to get better. And what we find is that it's actually because Hamilton already has treatments going on, and House's team have added treatments. We don't know which treatment is working, but House's logic is, oh, it can't be Hamilton's because Hamilton's been running his treatments for years and they haven't worked. And Hamilton just is like to House's team, like, they've just like randomly guessed some stuff. It can't possibly be them.
Mm.
And so it's this nice who done it, as in who's curing the patient. But what's quite nice after that is that House's team actually then go on to House is like, well, let's remove all of our treatments, and then we'll just add them slowly back in and see which one is working. Whereas Hamilton never actually does that. Hamilton just keeps him on the medicine, is like, let's just keep him on it and it will keep working.
Yeah.
Even though he has no real logical basis to believe that. And it's like through the treatment of the patients, you also see the styles. Like House is back to basics, really scientific. Let's work out the problem. Hamilton is like, the patient's happy, the patient's getting better. We've got him on some medicine. It must be working. Everything's fine.
Leave it be.
Yeah, leave it be. And it's like, it's very. I'd say it's quite subtle. I only really noticed it watching it this time, but it's really nice that the actual treatment ties into the like the drama and the methods of both doctors, and then Foreman is still stuck in the middle of that. He doesn't really know who to agree with because he's in both conversations with Hamilton and House as they both say, "Oh, the other person's wrong," and then it's really interesting seeing that like evolve and how then it turns out that House, then goes on to cure the patient. So this episode has a nice ending,
Yeah.
but yeah, it's really interesting to see once again this show is doing it really well where it ties the medicine and the human drama together. And we've spent the entire episode talking about like this Foreman story. Like there's also we'll talk about the patient next, but there's also the Do Not Resuscitate order which House breaks. He then goes to court in order to like face that, and then he uses the court system in order to basically keep the patient alive. I think he quotes that he has to face his accuser. So even though the patient wants to die, because he's being accused by the patient, it means that House basically forces him to stay alive through this court process. So even though the court process is like House's punishment, he just turns it back on and uses people because he's like an insanely calculating man. And there's just so much wonderful like storytelling going on here.
Yeah. Well, what happens is he gets accused of battery because he violated the DNR order. And basically he says, well, you can't really charge me for something if the person's dead, and I have a right because of the Constitution. I think it's the Sixth Amendment, which says you have the right to face your accuser.
Yeah.
And he then uses that as a way to keep him alive.
The one thing, just a very small note, I really like during that DNR scene where House breaks the DNR and incubates the patient. It's the first time we've seen House do some full hands-on medicine because he's always such a enigmatic mind,
He's
like
always
just coming up with solutions. Right? But this is one where he comes in and like, even though he probably hasn't done an incubation in like
intubation,
even though he hasn't done an intubation in probably like years, he just comes in and does it like effortlessly, and it's really nice seeing like that there's this practical element to House. Like he just has all of these incredible skills hidden that make him a complete doctor.
Yeah, and the other thing is,
I don't know why I enjoy that. I just do.
We do see some surgical skill when he's dissecting a baby.
That's true. Yeah, it's just I don't know why. It's just nice to see because the entire team refuses to break the rules and he has to do it. It's just nice that like House is always seen as like he always shows himself or presents himself as like the ultimate doctor, and it's just nice that then he can go in a room and completely do a procedure he hasn't done in years, and you're like, okay, he's quite good.
Yeah, he is.
Yeah, it's not really. I guess it's characterization in that sense, but it's just nice to see.
So we're getting to the point where there's some dialogue between Giles and House.
Yes, this is the patient story. Let's talk about the patient story. Carry on, Gaz.
So he says, Giles says, I've lost the use of my arm. I went to that session where I had the attack with the hope of just seeing if I could still play, and things got worse, and now I don't want to live anymore. And House says, well, are you just a musician? And that's the gateway into a discussion between House's vocation and his, and the comparison between the two. And like, what if you lost the ability to be a doctor? Would you want to live?
Yeah, and House actually like pauses for thought about that. It's usually in a discussion like House is the one who's attacking the person's like philosophy. But it's nice in this one. He's looking down at the floor. He's thinking.
He's been told what's up.
Yeah, that hasn't happened. This is why this patient is so interesting. This is one that really gets under his skin.
And the patient knows House's scenario. He doesn't have a wife, lives alone. He sacrifices certain elements of what could have been a comfortable life for him, easily accessible to him, just like it is accessible to Foreman if he chooses one path or the other, and is already accessible to Hamilton, yet he can't do it. He could easily live a life like that, but he can't, because then he wouldn't be who he is, and he'd rather be dead.
And there's this wonderful scene afterwards, like they have that emotional discussion where, like, you know, Giles tells him, like, if you couldn't be a doctor, you wouldn't want to live. So, why would you, like, I don't want to, if I can't be a musician, I don't want to live. And there's like a thoughtful moment, and House goes to the door, and then he just drags his like bed out and is
It
like,
takes one
you're
out.
right, I am completely obsessive and insane, and just takes him off to do more treatments.
Yeah.
Because I mean, even though like Giles is like using the idea that, if he uses his vocation, then there's no point in living.
Yeah.
And he thinks that will convince House that he should really like let him die. But then it reinforces House, because House is like, well, you've basically just told me that I'm a completely obsessive doctor, so of course I'm not going to stop. It's a really nice way that the scene twists on itself, because it's completely coherent. But after watching it, you really think House has been told, and then he's like, no, you've just reinforced my belief system.
And
And it's like, yeah, it's a really, like, the way that scenes like twists like that is really nice. I think a lesser show would have it as like a moment of reflection, but they go straight from that really serious point to just this, like, it's not comedy. I don't know what I would describe it, because it's funny, but is it like bathos, I guess? Like the absurdity of the scenario is what makes it funny, because like it's not like wacky. It's completely within the character, but there's something absurd about it, that like they have this philosophical conversation about obsession, and then obviously, because the person who is still functioning is still obsessive, he just goes and does something really obsessive.
yeah.
It's really great. It's like, it's a fantastic scene. It's because there is always a lot of the episodes have a moment where House talks with the patient, and like House will convince them of something, and like, it'll be really dramatic. But this one kind of has that setup where House is being convinced of something, and then it just becomes completely comedic afterwards. It's a really nice twist on it.
It's because it's a twist, and he goes, right then, I must do this. Okay, off we go to the MRI scan.
Yeah, and it's not at the climax; it's like halfway through.
Yeah. And the other thing that's really interesting is it's then followed by the lunch scene between Foreman and Dr. Hamilton, where it's kind of like, hey, I'm doing the lectures. Here's my life, uncomplicated but full of fun.
Well, and it's a great way to, I mean, it's the stories interacting.
Yeah.
Like it's not just, that entire, like, we spent like about what, 20 minutes talking about the Foreman story, and then we moved on to the patient story, and then like the scenes are edited and constructed in a way to show how those two stories are connected. Once again, the patient story is about obsession, Foreman's is about choosing between a different style of medicine, like what kind of doctor he wants to be, and like, but that story is also about obsession. It's like, does Foreman want to be the obsessive doctor like House? And by showing House dragging a patient out for a like emergency MRI to a doctor talking about how he's going to go golfing.
Yeah.
It's just, it's really well constructed, like the way that those two stories just meld into each other in a way that they seem so disconnected, but just the way the show is put together, they're just so obviously intertwined. And it's really great the way it starts emerging as like a coherent theme about halfway through.
Yeah. So now they're doing a radical surgery. So they're doing brain surgery to release a blood clot in his brain.
This is introduced in a really interesting way, because they originally wanted to give him some medicine, and the guy's like, no, I don't want that. It sounds unpleasant. And then Foreman actually comes up with the idea that they should do it surgically, because he says either we remove the clot and you're fine, or you die in the process, so it's a win-win.
Yeah.
And that's actually like, even though that's kind of, it's a really weird mixture of the two kind of methods of Hamilton and House. Like, Hamilton's behind him going, oh, that's really great that you've come to a compromise, but it's kind of an insane thing to Foreman to come up with, because it's so logical. It's so like, oh, it's a win-win. You either die or you live. And it's such a House thing to say, but Hamilton in a way like approves of it because he sees it as, oh, that's good patient care, but it's really not. That's just Foreman trying any trick in the book.
He missed the point, which was that Foreman saw the logic.
Yeah.
He didn't see this in terms of a compassionate solution. It's just like, well, you get what you want either way. You either get your leg or your arms back, or you don't, and you get what you want anyway. Win-win.
Yeah.
But we get to do what we've got to do, which is to resolve the issue, or at least try to.
Yeah, like Hamilton is thinking, oh, that's great, but yeah, he's completely missed the point. It's a coldly logical thing to say.
The other thing,
It's basically like the equivalent of like Pascal's wager.
yeah, it's
Like Pascal's wager, for anyone who doesn't know, is that the idea that you should believe in God just because if God exists when you die, then you can at least maybe go to heaven. Whereas if you die not believing in God and God does exist, then only bad things can happen and you don't really lose anything believing in God. And that's kind of it. Like, but it's a very bad reason to believe in God because there's no real like faith there. It's just coldly logical. Like, oh, maybe it's the best way for you to have a positive outcome.
Yeah.
There's no like actual belief there. Whereas, and that's kind of what that is. He's like, it could be mistaken for having a human side, but it's actually not. It's just a really cold way of looking at the situation.
utilitarian. It's a very
exactly.
utilitarian way of looking at it. It's like you get what you want whenever you get something
and
that you want. Either way, why would you resist?
Yeah, Foreman's wager.
But the thing is, you also see this idea of Hamilton saying, "Oh, maybe the medication is reversing the ALS, which means that I'm going to write another research paper," and he sees it as his treatment and House's treatment are in competition with each other. But actually, House doesn't care about that competition. It's not after something as a result of the treatment. He just wants to solve the problem. He's not looking for other outputs. And Hamilton is completely misconceived how House thinks about things. And he thinks about things exactly the same way as he does, because they're both described as good doctors.
Yeah, because House has said this before, in that, because people have said, "Oh, House, you don't care about the patient," but he says that's a good thing, because I'm only thinking about solving the problem. And as you say, like people see the way House deals with the patient as insincere and like really like disrespectful. But then you have Hamilton, who would popularly be seen as like a nice doctor who's very empathetic. But he's actually talking about what he can get from the case. Like House never talks about gaining anything from a case. He's just like, let's just solve it and get on with the next one. Yeah. Whereas Hamilton, as you say, is like, oh, I could write another paper, which is way more disingenuous.
It's way more transactional.
Yeah.
Well, no, it's just transactions of a different kind. Hamilton is looking for a transaction that's extrinsic, right? Like I say.
Yeah.
Something material for something material. I fix you, I get something back, which is the Messiah complex, but also prestige or whatever. House is like, I solve your problem, you get better, and you get to live. And what I get out of it is I solve a problem that's bugging me because it's interesting. So now we're getting to the point where he's getting worse.
Yeah, so they've now removed all the medicine. Oh, House has removed all of his medicine, and Hamilton hasn't removed any of his medicine. So pretty much proving that House's medicine was making the difference. But Hamilton just didn't do anything because he was just confident. So kind of showing up Hamilton in that way. And and then what's nice is then the team kick into action. This is when they start introducing the medicines and eventually solve the case and solve his disability.
Yeah, they wrap it all up very quickly in short succession. You always find that when at the late stage of an episode, when all the team comes together, you're just like, yeah, they're getting to the end now.
Yeah. Like that court case sequence is like it plays a key role in the episode, and it's like it's a really like shows how House will like twist any circumstance to to his benefit. He even at one point like diagnoses the judge with heart disease,
Fabricates a
and will.
diagnosis.
Mhm.
He fabricates
Yeah,
the
he
diagnosis.
yeah he fabricates a diagnosis, which at first you think, wow, House is being really genuine and nice and using those talents, but it just turns out that House was just once again making the judge distracted by thinking about how he might die soon in order to
Yeah.
get away with it. And it's but yeah, that's like a huge subplot to just chuck in. And then it turns out that actually because Giles wants to die, he actually drops the case,
Yeah.
the court case, and then House is just allowed to operate him again. So it's kind of but it's kind of a subplot that doesn't really go anywhere, but it's integral because it allows House to force Giles to be kept alive, and kind of shows how House will twist any situation into his favor. So it's but yeah, like compared to like last episode where it was just like a very simple, they're just looking around, like, and you kind of think, oh, in a 40-minute runtime, like how much can you actually do? And then an episode like this comes, and actually you can do loads in a 40-minute runtime. Like loads of stuff happens in this. The fact there's clinic scenes, there's like an entire like court case subplot. Like there's a lot going on in exactly the same runtime. Like, and it shows like just with tight writing and good pacing, you can do a lot.
Yeah. But the climax of this scene is not the heal the patient getting better. It's the conflict between Foreman and House in House's office.
Yeah. No, go on. We'll go. Yeah, no, share your thoughts on it because it's a great scene.
He says, you make a mistake, I hold you accountable. I'm not going to make you feel good because you made a mistake, even if you made a good even if it was a mistake that was inspired and it was innovative and interesting. And he says you should feel great because you did something great, but you should feel also crap because you did something wrong. So if you do something great doesn't mean that it's going to be right.
Mm. Yeah, he kind of points out how while Foreman feels like he's more emotionally nurtured by Hamilton, you can tell in their exchanges, like the way they kind of chuckle politely at each other's jokes and sort of, just talk about the social element, that there's an element of Foreman being insincere and faking it. And House is kind of pointing out that actually, even though he's meaner, it's the Hamilton approach which is more insincere. Like Hamilton, doesn't really care much for the patients in any meaningful way. And when he he doesn't yell at Foreman because he doesn't care. Like House yells at Foreman and treats him like shit when he makes a mistake because he's like, it matters. You should feel bad.
Yeah. Whereas
Hamilton,
the thing about Hamilton is he'd say, yeah, you did something really interesting. You did something really great. Pat on the back. You did something inspired.
you might get a raise.
Yeah. Or, but what if, and the patient died anyway? It's like with this ALS treatment that he'd been given. It was so good, right? He was trying his best to reverse it, but it didn't help the patient either way. He just had the same condition and then he died, right?
Yeah,
or would have
because
died.
Hamilton was happy to give him the ALS diagnosis, which was just a death sentence, and be like, oh, well, let's just rub our hands with it. At least we have an answer. But House was never happy with that.
Yeah, he was like, well, if it's wrong, it's wrong. There's no way. And if you do something that's wrong, you have to work hard to correct it. And also, you've got to get it right. You've got to make it right. You have to solve it. You can't just walk away from those things and say, oh, okay. And that's the difference. And I think Foreman in that moment realizes it. And then just as that discussion between House and Foreman concludes, the cure presents itself. It's as if them talking it out, them resolving that issue, House telling him why he's so hard on Foreman, cures the patient in a way.
Well, yeah, because it's almost in Foreman's mind. He decides which method is better, and then in real life, the optimum method presents itself as the winner. Yeah, it's like in like the abstract sense, the method presents itself as better, and then that is replicated in reality. It's just this final argument. Like, not only does House convince Foreman, but House, convinces reality that the method is better. because it works.
Yeah.
And that's all that matters.
What matters is being right.
Mm.
So we get into the end of the episode, and we have this amazing little interaction between Giles and House, which kind of just tops off the whole episode. It just propels it even higher because it gives us some clue as to who House is in some way.
Mm.
And Giles says, you've always been an asshole even before you had the leg problem. And then House says, yeah, sure, whatever. But then what happens is Giles says, well, you're in do you take those painkillers all the time? How many do you take? And House kind of tries to explain him taking the painkillers, saying, I'm in pain. And Giles says, well, we're all in pain. And I think that's an interesting little interaction between the two of them.
Yeah, completely. Because House doesn't give him an answer.
No. And I think that's really revealing. It's like a bit of a blind spot.
Well, it's this, and that is something that's explored. But yeah, they bring up the show consistently does that. It like hints to something, and then a couple of episodes properly explores it. It does it with Wilson's affair and like Cameron's backstory, and like Foreman's kind of like resentment to House's methods. But it's just doing it here. I agree. I completely agree, and it's nice that you've spotted it because it's a really nice way of doing it. It's this and also it kind of shows like House doesn't say, oh, I take 6 pills a day and this is why. Like it's just I'm in pain, it helps me function. It's this whatever works.
Yeah.
Because that's what they're both about. It's just like just staying alive so you can just keep doing things that you love.
Doing something so that he feels as though he's in control. I don't know. His addiction is really complicated. And it's really emotionally deep. And I'm really interested. I'm very much interested to see again how that progresses because it's very, very dark.
Yeah, this is like, I mean, I feel like we're getting into like summarization here, but this is just a fantastic episode.
Yeah.
It just like it hints at future episodes with House's addictions. It like is really focused on Foreman. Like you see, you have like an episode like the Socratic method, which kind of shows like Foreman's reaction to alcoholism. And it kind of does it as like it has that as a subplot, and it's a great subplot, and it's really well explored. But
that's Chase, isn't it?
No, Chase, sorry. Yeah, like you see Chase's like response to alcoholism, and it's kind of like it's there, and it's a great subplot within the episode, and it adds a lot. But this is what happens when you spend an entire episode focused on one character. Like Foreman gets the limelight here.
Yeah, he does.
In the same way that Cameron did in Maternity. Like Foreman is front and center here, almost more than the patient. Like they're really diagnosing Foreman.
Yeah.
And what he wants. And it's I mean, then you have that, and then you have like the like comparison between the patient's obsession with music and House's, and that reveals more about like House's like way of life. And then you have the funny clinic scenes, and then you still have this entire like court scene where you see House playing the system, and then you have like all this other stuff about Hamilton, the doctor, and then comparing him to House. There's so much like focusing and like drawing in on different characters and how they relate, and it's fantastic. The fact that they do that in about 45 minutes while diagnosing a like medical problem which is then like related because the whole medical problem is based on like these different methodologies and how these doctors like work differently. This is it's fantastic.
Yeah, and it was the ultimate cause of Giles's problem was an arterial venous malformation. So it's where the artery and the vein connect to each other without the use of capillaries, and
Hmm.
it can cause issues. It's largely asymptomatic if it appears elsewhere, but it appeared in the spine, and that was one of the reasons why that was the reason why he couldn't use his legs. Was that
Yeah.
it was impacting on the central nervous system and preventing any communication between his legs and the rest of his central nervous system. Well, but I just wanted to say on the court system, another the court scene is that it alludes to a style of writing that appears in House a lot, which is the kind of clever subversion mechanic that they use, which is he's in court, he stands up, he's been chafing at the formalities of the court system where he's trying to represent himself, he's making asides, he's trying to clarify things without using his attorney. But then there's this audience subversion thing that occurs where House, as you said earlier, he diagnoses the judge as having clubbing in his fingers, which is a sign of heart disease, and says, "Have you ever had any family history of heart disease?" And you think, "Oh wow, he can't switch off. He needs to use this. He's kind of forced to help heal people in a kind of miraculous way." It's like, wow, he's doing some good, and maybe this might help him with the court system because he's doing a good thing, and it makes him look like a good person, and therefore maybe the judge will be more preferential to his judgment, which is a completely naive way of thinking about the legal system, by the way.
Yeah.
That you can do that, but the whole point is to make the audience think, well, wow, he can just do that, and he's doing a good thing, so maybe he'll get a good result. He gets a good result, but the audience subversion is that, no, I made it up. And you think, oh,
Yeah.
he didn't do a good thing. He did a good thing so that he did the bad thing of largely fabricating something as a means to distract the judge from making probably a sound judgment by preying on his mortality, and then getting a good result out of it, which is just crazy. But in House's ethics, he doesn't see it that way. He just sees it as a means to helping the patient and also solve the problem.
Yeah. Well, it's this revelation that, as you say, like you mistake it that he has a desire to heal that he can't turn off.
Yeah.
But it's when Wilson says you have a Rubik's complex. It says, oh, actually, the thing he can't turn off is not his healing desire to heal. It's his desire to just problem solve. And being in a court case is a problem that he needs solving. How can he do that? Well, he'll just trick the judge using any means necessary, and it just turns out that he knows a lot about like medicine, so he knows that he can emotionally manipulate him. If House was like a gangster, he'd have like set it up so somebody went round the judge's house and threatened him with or threatened his family. Like it's just like he's just using the skills he has, and yeah, you're right. It's a really nice way to demonstrate that.
But it's a good audience subversion tactic. It's a nice little writing device to bring in. Kind of
totally.
It also brings it down to earth a little bit. It doesn't make you. It's a reminder of saying, well, this is not a a nice world in a way. This is spit and sawdust. This is you do what you can to get things done. It's very cynical. Yeah, that's the word I'd use. It is a very cynical worldview being projected by that audience subversion, but it's cool. And I just wanted to say that because it was something that we covered kind of lightly, but I think it's just to highlight something that writers, especially in this series, use a lot, is the audience subversion tactic, making you think one thing and presupposing one thing, and actually, no, you fool. I felt that when I watched it for the first time. I
No,
thought, oh,
totally. I'm glad you went back to it because it's like it's. I mean, like we. I mean, I've been saying, oh, it's great writing, but that is a perfect example of good subversion. No, I'm glad you went back to it because yeah, I mean, like if you ever needed a case study for how to write an interesting scene, then that is it. Because I think in a lot of other shows, that court case might have just been some other stupid stuff that happened to keep it interesting. And like that's how you have
we
an
did.
interesting subplot that then you do something with. Like we learn a lot about House in that moment. Like we're still getting to know House. I mean, the more when we're talking about the series, I have real trouble like because House is such a fully formed character at this point. But like this is episode 9, like we don't know half the stuff. Like there's loads of other things which are mentioned later, and this is just like a really good way to just introduce that kind of dirty, like kind of tricksy element of House that we've seen, but not to that extent where he's like diagnosing people
Yeah.
with like like death sentences when they're just trying to do their job.
And I just want to do like just a final thing from me. I think you've summarized the general plot, but I just wanted to emphasize the broader themes and also a little bit my own take on what I see this episode is about. I think this is an episode where we learn a lot about Foreman, but I feel like we learn a hell of a lot about House. We learn a lot about how he thinks. We learn a lot about the mechanics and rationale behind how he thinks things through. His worldview is on display here in a way that you get hints of, but it's never really fully displayed like this. That he's intrinsically motivated. He's willing to sacrifice human relationships or the potential for human relationships, as well as the comforts that can be provided by his vocation by taking an easier route. He could have lived a life that was a lot easier for him, a lot more comfortable, and he's completely forgone that. And we learnt that through his interactions with Giles. You just can't do it any other way. And I think we've learnt also that the way that this episode is constructed, there are like several layers of interaction going on. You have the mirror being held up to House with Giles as a character. We see a kind of a weird Moriarty to Holmes interaction between Hamilton and House.
Marty.
Moriarty.
Maybe are they playing that word trickery again?
Maybe not Moriarty, because Moriarty is actually intrinsic as a character. He's intrinsically motivated to create criminality, but there's like a diametric opposite between House and Marty, in the sense that between them we see the extrinsically motivated way that medicine can be done versus House's intrinsic model, and they're coming up ahead. And that's all being mediated through the conflicts between two paths, between House and Hamilton. And then at the most basic level, you see the conflicts between House and Foreman, because he makes a decision. In fact, he makes the decision the moment he doesn't resist the intubation.
Yeah, that's a good point.
He makes a decision to stay with House because he's seen how these two sets of motivations work, and he would much prefer House's model than Marty Hamilton's model.
Yeah, he chooses meaning.
Yeah, and he also chooses conflict. He chooses to stay with House despite the fact that and House makes it very clear, I'm going to have a go at you when you're wrong. He chooses conflict as a means to practice his profession, rather than the kind of consensus or lack of conflict that governs Marty Hamilton's realm of operating in medicine, which is kind of just say, yeah, you did a great thing. The patient's dead. We did what we could. We'll let it go.
Yeah.
And
I quite like as well that Marty Hamilton throughout the whole thing like isn't like a stupid character as well.
no, he's a good character.
Yeah,
He's a
he's like
clever man.
like there's like lots of elements to him that are very preferable, and you understand why Foreman might want to be like him. I
Yeah.
sometimes we've talked about how the show has a habit of making certain characters stupid, so House can just win an argument simply. But yeah, there's a proper conflict here because Marty is like fundamentally a nice man. He gets on with everyone. He means well. He's not like evil. He just
He's
like
he's zero conflict. His operating model is no conflict whatsoever. He wants no conflict at all.
hmm,
He wants to just go through life and treat the patients. If they live, great. If they die, they die. There's nothing more you can do. It's just the way of life for him. But as we see in House with a lot of characters, with the main characters like Chase and Cameron, Cuddy, Wilson, Foreman, and House, they have to make. They're given a choice between two, in the end, bad outcomes. There's the kind of materially rewarding outcome, but spiritually / rationally shit outcome, or there's the materially and socially shit outcome, but the kind of vocationally really, really good outcome. And you've got to choose, but it's a Hobson's choice. You choose one, you lose something. You lose one part of yourself if you choose one thing, or you lose the other. And there's no right, really. House sees it as a right and a wrong choice, but really, the characters have to make a sacrifice to proceed with either one.
yeah,
And that's great. That's great writing when you
yes.
when you get to the point where you can write a sophisticated situation where they have to make that choice.
Hmm.
And that to me is what makes House really, really good.
I also very well said, Gaz. That's a fantastic analysis of that like interaction.
Yeah.
Oh, but yeah, I also wanted to um add on like I assume this is like incorporated for a reason, but we know that Foreman's background is that he comes from quite an impoverished background.
Mm.
I think the what gives like an extra level of depth to Foreman, which isn't necessarily pointed out in this episode, or many episodes, I don't think. But yeah, like Foreman, because he has had a life of such want, like he tried really hard to be a doctor and be great because he wanted to escape that like class system. And you can kind of see Hamilton is kind of what he's been aspiring to. They're sitting around having nice lunches, talking about the things that they could do, the money that they could make. There's like there's a luxury, there's a comfort there that he hasn't had.
Yeah.
And it's like House is trying to show him that there's more to life than that because he's been so focused on trying to get those things. And House is saying, look, it's not about the money. There's meaning beyond that, even though that's what you've been chasing. And it's not brought up in the episode, but I think Foreman, the fact that he's been characterized with that background really adds like an extra like level to Foreman. I don't think it would. I think it would be interesting if like Cameron or Chase were having that problem as well, but like Cameron and Chase don't have that extra addition to their character background. Like it makes sense that Foreman is struggling to choose between the kind of obsessive like do medicine because you love it and the like extra level of material like gain, which Hamilton is like expressing as being a good reason to be a doctor. Like Chase has lived a nice life. you know, it wouldn't be as interesting if Chase was just driven by, oh, and you know, I can make some money and like go golfing. Like that's something that Foreman's been fantasizing about his entire childhood, you know. But House is kind of showing him that there's more to life than that.
I didn't see it from that. I didn't reflect on it in that kind of socioeconomic context, but that's really interesting. But
Well, it's not
and the
brought up in
thing
the show,
is,
but I
yeah,
feel I can totally imagine the writers were thinking that because it fits too well.
yeah.
And
Well,
it's
it's one of the you've diagnosed one of the diseases plaguing Foreman. It fits well.
fantastic. Well, um, yeah. I mean, unless you got something else to discuss, Gaz, I thought that was a fantastic discussion on that episode. I think we've revealed that that is a great episode
Yeah.
because that's by far the longest that we've just chatted about all of the elements of it, even more than the Socratic method.
Oh, I didn't even notice.
Because yeah, the difference between this and the Socratic method, I think what I found interesting was when we were talking about the Socratic method, we were um, even we admitted it was quite a like we were kind of all over the place in terms of we were discussing bits and bobs and then trying to show how they connected. Um, but this was a great episode because you can talk about it chronologically as events unfold, but there's still so many things to draw on. But yeah, I think that's a fantastic episode, and I assume you do as well.
Oh yeah, I think it's really well written. I think has so many themes going on, but the main central themes are so well imbricated together. They're kind of put together really, really well, and it's
Mm.
solid. And they're good little hooks to keep you in. I mean, we didn't even get to discussing the clinic patient because the main A plot was just so good. But I don't think we'll be like revealing too much by discussing that. I think we used our time quite sensibly to kind of
Yeah. Well,
get into the.
that clinic patient is just it's a skit, and it's a great way to break it up. But the rest of the episode is so great and full that it's not, yeah, like talking about the clinic patient would be an anticlimax almost
Yeah, I think so.
because it's just such a silly like it's such a silly like funny um like scene. And that's like in the context that I think in a maybe in like if it was last episode we would talk more about it because we'd want to like chat about some stuff. But yeah, I almost feel like you know talking about the diabetic in denial
Wow.
who's in the clinic is like it's you know it's there's nothing there's in comparison there's not enough there because the rest of the episode is so good.
Yeah, I agree.
And I'm not saying the clinic scene takes away from the episode. It adds a funny scene onto the rest of it, and it doesn't like I didn't feel like anything was underdeveloped by having it there. It's just like it's just a great episode with so much to talk about that yeah, like we didn't get to it for a reason because we didn't need to.
Yeah, the A plot was so strong. We had to kind of use our time, how little we have, to just focus on that. And I think if you're really interested in the clinic scene, I'm sure you can find a pal to discuss it with. But we'll leave
Yeah,
that
I
for
mean
you guys to work out.
absolutely. Well, yeah, well, thanks very much, Gaz, for joining me in talking about DNR.
Always a pleasure, never a chore.
Absolutely. Well, this show will is not DNR. We will be resuscitating it next week, same time, Monday morning, BST, and we'll see you then with hopefully we can have as much of an interesting discussion about the next episode.
Amen to that.
See you then.